Some ancient creation stories seem to suggest that our ancestors had more advanced mental, physical, and technological powers. Do you believe that? What have you found in your research along these lines?
Higher powers, I think one of my favorite stories of origins that I've studied in my path in researching the Eden series has been the Popol Vuh, which talks about the evolution of humanity as something that was aided through external interventions. And it talks about a period when our ancestors were smarter than we are now. Now, this shouldn't be too much of a shock because everything we find about so-called primitive man turns out to be not as primitive as we thought. I remember when we discovered Ötzi, the Iceman, 5,000 years old, who we thought should have been wearing bear skins and going, ugh. We found somebody who had done his own dentistry or had dentistry done. He'd cut his hair. He's wearing textiles with different stitch patterns. He had a medical pouch on his belt. He was more advanced than we thought. And then when we look at megalithic sites, we will often go down the layers of megalithic building and realize that the older is more advanced, and maybe so advanced that we can't even explain how they did it. So what we find in the real world of archaeology suggests that humans have been smart for a very long time and may have had technologies that we don't understand today, whether it's megalithic building or other things. The Popol Vuh, which is the Mayan story of origins from out of Guatemala, speaks about our ancestors having greater cognitive powers in the past. And there's a moment where the feathered serpents who are involved in developing humanity produce a Homo sapiens 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 that is too smart for them to work with. They really just want a working class. And so their chief genetic engineer, this is the Kukulkan figure, Cucumatz, Quetzalcoatl, has to go back and find a solution for human beings being too smart. And the solution that he comes up with, this vapor that's sprayed over human beings, what it does is limit the human being's sight. That's how it's expressed. And so if we think about how is our sight limited, what would it mean for those limits not to be there? Well, our sight is limited by surfaces. We can't see into things. We can't see through things and behind things. We have had to develop technologies to do that. We can't see a great distance. We can't see beyond the horizon. We have had to develop technologies to do that. We can't see the past. We can't see the future. We can only see the present. Although from time to time, we might have glimpses of future sight and wonder where that came from. And so this story hints at our ancestors having better far sight, better future sight, X-ray vision, telescopic sight, better empathy, better telepathic connection, altogether more intelligent and more conscious, but in ways that we can relate to. As I say, we've created technologies to do a lot of these things, and sometimes we have anomalous experiences that make us think, oh, I wonder if I could get my brain firing off better than it usually does. I wonder if I could do that far sight thing again. I knew exactly what that other person was thinking. I knew who it was who was about to call me on the phone. I knew what had just happened to my friend in another country. Is that something I could develop? And the Popol Vuh suggests, yes, this is all vestigial of our earlier state. Our ancestors knew better how to do these things. And if you get into my book, Echoes of Eden, that's a book where I spend some time with indigenous elders and the curators of traditional knowledge. Very often, our indigenous cultures have protocols that are aimed at reactivating our higher cognitive powers. And a lot of indigenous traditions will say our ancestors were better at these things than we are. And the more I listen with respect to indigenous story, the more I think that was probably true. I think there are other evidences that this has been taken more seriously in the past. There was a period of 100 years between 1880 and the 1980s, where in Australia, Canada, and America, Indigenous ceremony was illegalized. And clearly the intention, and those are three separate countries, and yet they're running with the same Uber policy. The idea that if you can stop initiation ceremony for 100 years, then you have discontinued that Indigenous tradition. And I think part of the agenda there was to be able to govern the entire population of territory, including the Indigenous populations. But the way it was done, and I go into this in Echoes of Eden, suggests to me there was some feeling that there were powers that Indigenous people had, that traditional cultures had maintained, that gave them an edge cognitively in their engagement with the colonizing force. I think it was something that was taken seriously. So for all those reasons, I take that view seriously. And I'm very interested in the question, can we nurture our higher cognitive powers? Can we become more intelligent and more conscious? And when I read writers like Plato, I see that he is using every means at his disposal, whether it's the application of logic to things we observe. Today, we would call that science. Whether it's listening to Indigenous story in the way I suggest in my books, whether it's having transpersonal experiences, which he references with regard to the cult of Hecate and the Eleusinian mysteries. He is taking all these different routes to see if you and I can be more conscious and more intelligent, because the understanding is we are capable of so much more.
Paul Wallis is an internationally best-selling author, researcher, and scholar of ancient mythologies. Over the last decade, Paul's work has probed the world's mythologies and ancestral narratives for the insights they hold on our origins as a species and our potential as human beings. As a senior churchman, Paul served as a church doctor, a theological educator, and an archdeacon in the Anglican Church in Australia. Paul's work in church ministry has included training pastors in the interpretation of biblical texts. His work in biblical translation and interpretation has revealed a forgotten layer of ancient story, with far-reaching implications for our understanding of human origins and our place in the cosmos.